Bob Herbert's OpEd.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. Americans spend more money on lottery tickets every year than they spend on streaming services, concert tickets, books, and movie tickets combined. A recent Powerball player in California was the single winner of a jackpot worth more than $2 billion. Fantasizing about the instant riches of a big-time lottery win can be fun. What would you do with all that money? But what's the truth about lotteries? Are the odds of winning a Powerball or Mega Millions jackpot so big that you have basically no chance at all? Do the lotteries raise the huge sums for education or other public services that they claim? Are people who can't afford it loading up on Powerball, Mega Millions, and dozens of different scratch-off games to the point where they hurt themselves and seriously neglect their families? We'll put these questions and more to my guest, the historian Jonathan D. Cohen, who has written a timely and compelling new book, For a Dollar and a Dream, State Lotteries in Modern America. Welcome, Jonathan.
Hi, Bob. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming in. Really appreciate it. So annual lottery sales in the U.S. are now, I guess, between $90 and $100 billion, a staggering amount. You've done an amazing amount of research, and you've talked to tons of lottery players. Why are these games so popular?
So I think there's many reasons, of course, why lottery tickets are popular. I think one of them, and one that I advance throughout the book, is that lotteries are more than just a type of gambling game. That lotteries are turned to and are seen by many Americans as a form of social mobility, as a form of upward mobility, as a chance at the American dream. And maybe some of the best evidence for this is that when the economy goes in the tank, when unemployment rises, when poverty rates go up, casino gambling goes down, horse race gambling goes down, sports gambling goes down, but lottery play goes up.
Wow.
And I think there's more as a result. I think there's more going on here than just gambling. I think people are playing for something bigger and for something more.
So the bulk of the people who buy these lottery tickets, and we're not just talking about Powerball and Mega Millions, there's all kinds of lottery tickets. Who's mostly buying these tickets, and what are the games that they're playing the most?
Sure. So 50% of Americans buy a lottery ticket once a year, and that's often during these sort of big Powerball or Mega Millions jackpots where people who don't play very often, myself included, might buy a ticket. But when you're talking about the day-to-day and the week-to-week, 1 in 8 Americans buy a lottery ticket once a week. Which is a lot, and 20 to 30% of players account for as much as 70 or 80% of lottery sales. And that 20 to 30% is disproportionately Black and Latino, disproportionately less educated, and disproportionately poorer. So these are the people, again, who make up a larger share of that 1 in 8 of Americans who play once a week, and they're the ones who are playing long before the Powerball gets on the news and as a daily, weekly habit on all types of lottery games, as you alluded to.
So I live in Manhattan, and you'll go into a newspaper store, although they're not newsstands anymore very much, or you go into a convenience store,
yeah.
and you'll see, I'll see people, this is not when there's a big Powerball payoff,
Right.
I'll see people standing in there playing $70, $80, buying $70 or $80 worth of tickets, sometimes over $100 worth of tickets.
Yeah.
It seems to me, it's none of my business, but it seems to me that these folks can't really afford to be spending that much on lottery tickets. What's going on there? And also, how widespread is that? That's my anecdotal
Right.
Evidence, but how widespread is that?
So there are many things going on here. I think among them is for many people. So the very, very poor, the bottom quintile, bottom 20th% in terms of real income, don't actually play the lottery all that much. It's the next quintile up, the next group up, the 20 to 40th percentile. So these are people who maybe have disposable income,
right,
who have a source of income, but have don't have other chances in the economy through entrepreneurship to get ahead. And so they reason that even if they have a little bit of financial stability, for example, they don't have, through their job, through the economy, through entrepreneurship, a chance at a new life. They don't have a chance at something bigger.
Right.
They don't have a chance to be rich. And that's what the lottery provides that they can't get anywhere else, and why many of them reason that it's worth a shot. As infinitesimal as the odds may be, it's worth a chance at a new life.
So the folks who do play the lottery, no matter what income group they're coming from, of course, you just mentioned they want a shot at getting rich.
Yeah.
And one of the many important points you make in the book is that our idea, when I say our, I mean Americans writ large, our idea of wealth and riches has really changed since, say, the post-World War II era, when the first wave of the baby boomers were born. How have those views changed, and why do you think they changed?
Yeah, so what you're describing is what I think a post-World War II specifically, sort of time of economic egalitarianism, when the definition of wealth, the definition of success, of the good life, of the American dream, was a white picket fence in the suburbs and two cars in the garage. And then around the 1980s, 1990s, we get this sort of Wall Street-ization of American culture, and the rise of Fortune magazine and the Forbes 100 list, and the rise of folks like Donald Trump and Lee Iacocca, the celebrity CEOs. And wealth sort of takes a new place as a reassertion of the American values and American strength after the Cold War. And I don't think it's a coincidence that sort of lines up with the rise, not just of lotteries, but of big Powerball type games, rollover jackpot type games. And I don't think it's a coincidence now that, amid the rise of sort of the cultural rise of billionaires and folks like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, that we now have the first billion-dollar jackpots. I think that's, as the goalposts of what it means to be rich have gotten longer and have gotten bigger, jackpots have gotten bigger as a result, to sort of whet players' appetite for the new definition of the good life.
Right. So, I mean, it makes me think of that movie Wall Street and the line, greed is good. And you never would have heard that. I grew up in that early post-World War II period that you're talking about, back in the 50s and 60s. And people were hesitant, even if they were very wealthy, to kind of show off their wealth and that sort of thing.
Exactly.
That's over.
And the lottery gives everyone a stake in that greed, everyone a chance. People who can't afford investment, they can't afford a 401k, they can afford, to your point earlier, $2 in lottery tickets, maybe a little bit more, and that gives them their chance at that wealth.
So we've talked about the purchasers of lottery tickets. Let's talk about the sellers. All but a handful of states are now running lotteries. It's not like these games are like mega money makers for state governments. So why are so many states involved? Why do they want to run the lotteries?
So in raw dollar terms, they are big money makers, except when the moment you compare the money with the actual size of the state budget. You said it exactly right.
So percentage-wise, it's not great.
But it looks great on paper.
But
$252 billion, exactly.
Right.
It's a lot of money in raw dollar terms, and the reason for this, and we can get into it, is that only 20 to 30% of every lottery dollar goes to the state beneficiary, to the fund. So it's a lot less than people think. But states, liberal and conservative states alike, I think, are sort of starved for revenue and have been for a long time, and there are very few sources of non-tax revenue that are available for states, and the lottery, and most recently sort of other forms of gambling as well, provide this bonanza that they just can't get anywhere else. And even if it's only a small amount of money, even if it's very relatively small compared to the size of the overall state revenue, they sort of will take any money they can get, as small as it might be.
I mean, you go into this in the book. You talk about that period some decades ago when we had the tax revolts. I mean, famously in California, for example. Can you talk a little bit about that transition? What was financing for state governments like before that period, and then what did it transition to?
Right. So this is sort of part of my central argument about why lotteries took so long to emerge, but then once they emerged, why they came so quickly. Lotteries have been around since the Han Dynasty by some estimation. So why did it take until 1963 for Americans to sort of restart the spread of state lotteries? And I argue that in the aftermath of World War II, in the immediate aftermath, states were able to raise raise services, increase services and social spending without increasing taxes. And that went on great for a couple of years until the 1960s, 1970s, and that arrangement started to collapse.
And this was because the economy was booming, the economy was doing so well?
Yeah, and I think the United States was in a unique international position in the aftermath of World War II, and sort of the pent-up demand from the war and the access of cheap raw materials from overseas, and then the rise of overseas markets, and then the lack of competition from countries like Japan and
Countries
Germany.
that had been devastated during the war.
Exactly.
They had not made their comeback yet.
Exactly. And then amid things like the oil crisis in the 1970s, and then the rise of simultaneous inflation and unemployment, that arrangement starts to collapse and individuals get hurt. And we hear a lot about how sort of individual economies tanked in the 70s, but it did for states as well. And that leaves them sort of starved for any revenue they can get. And increasingly they're turning to creative sources of revenue like gambling rather than sort of bread and butter taxes, which had been part of how we funded government for a long time.
Right. Now, you devoted a fair amount of space in your book to a company called Scientific Games, I believe it's called. What does that company do, and why did it warrant so much attention in your book?
Yeah. So Scientific Games, to start things off, they invent the scratch ticket, or what we now know as the scratch ticket. And that is very quickly introduced in 1974 in Massachusetts for the first time, and that's their sort of bread and butter industry.
For those who don't know, explain how the scratch tickets work.
Sure. So a scratch ticket, nowadays you can get them as they're up to $50 in Texas, but as cheap as $1 at any convenience store, and it's sort of immediate gratification. You just scratch off an opaque latex plastic cover foil on the ticket, and you have some numbers, and there's matching numbers on there with prizes listed underneath, and it will tell you right away whether you won or not. Unlike a game like Powerball or the daily numbers, we have to wait a couple days, maybe a couple hours to win. So it's instant gratification. And for reference, today scratch tickets account for 60 to 65% of total annual lottery sales in the country. So this is really now where the moneymaker is for states.
You can get a $50 scratch ticket?
In Texas. That's right. Made by Scientific Games, our old friends.
Wow. Yeah. How much can you win? If you spend $50 for this ticket and you scratch it off and you know right then whether you've won or not, how much might you win?
So the prizes do get into the six figures now. And the prize curve for scratch tickets is shaped like a U, where there's a lot of prizes at the beginning. So a free ticket, $2, $10, $20, and then not a lot sort of in the middle, and then at the end, you know, what everyone's playing for, $100,000, $250,000, whatever the case may be. So we've sort of seen the jackpotification, if you will, of scratch tickets, but a lot of people, as you alluded to earlier, put in $100 on scratch tickets, win $80, put $80 into scratch tickets, get $50, and so on. They sort of keep that cycle going.
So how did Scientific Games become so important? I mean, they run lottery operations in these states, but there was competition.
That's right.
What happened?
So there was competition. They were the industry leader, and because they were the industry leader, they wanted to sell their tickets to more states. And there were 14 states that had enacted lotteries between 1963 and 1977, and then the market sort of cooled from there. States sort of realized that the lotteries were not raising as much money as they thought, or they weren't able to sort of subsidize entire state budgets, which is what folks had initially hoped for, initially planned. And instead,
I just want to interrupt you. In the beginning, they thought that they could raise enough revenues from selling lottery tickets to cover the entire cost of state government?
Yeah. Oh, we'll never have to. All these quotes in my chapter on this period is from New Jersey. Is about New Jersey. Oh, we'll never have to pay any taxes again because we're going to have this lottery. Or we can increase every social service fourfold thanks to this new lottery bonanza. And again, these are voters and policymakers who don't want to raise taxes, but also don't want to cut social services.
Right.
And they have no other way to get money. And lo and behold, here comes this lottery, which to their minds is going to solve every problem under the sun that their states face.
It's almost as if the governments were approaching the lottery in the same way that the players were approaching the lottery, you know, with this pie in the sky, this kind of hope for instant riches or whatever that does not pan out.
Exactly, and I think that's when we denigrate lottery players and we call them poor and stupid and irrational for buying lottery tickets. I think a lot of these lawmakers who enacted lotteries are just as prone to these wishful, hopeful, irrational beliefs about gambling. I do want to return to Scientific Games, which, again, as the industry leader in scratch tickets, basically AstroTurfs, or it pays for initiative referenda in Western states, in California, in Colorado, Oregon, Arizona, on the promise of, enact a lottery here to benefit cause X, and the causes vary state by state. In California, it's education. In Colorado, it's public parks. Right. In Oregon, it goes into the general fund for complicated legal reasons. But they try to make the cause synonymous with gambling. So, enact this proposition, this referendum, not because you want to gamble, but because you want to help school kids, or because you want to help public parks, or in Washington, D.C., it's for emergency services. So you want to help our police and fire departments. And it works. Voters pass the initiatives that Scientific Games writes the bills. They pay for folks to gather signatures. They pay for the advertising, and then they summarily, not coincidentally, win the contracts to provide lottery tickets to the state. And that is what sort of restarts the spread of state lotteries across the country. The market had cooled, as I said. States were sort of coming to the idea that a lottery was going to solve all their problems, and Scientific Games not only brings the lottery to all these new states and makes the lottery seem inevitable as a state program that's going to keep spreading, it also sharpens the financial promise. And now it's not going to fund your entire state budget. Now it'll just fund one specific program, and that's a new hook for states that they can that helps lottery spread across the country in the 1980s and 1990s.
So now, what's the reality been? Have the states realize the payoff for education, or for the state parks, or whatever that they were promising? Has that been happening?
It's a tough question. Yes, they are making money from lotteries. No, the lotteries have not been a panacea by any stretch of the imagination that have sort of significantly either benefited these programs or made it so that taxpayers don't have to pay as much in taxes. In states like New York, and there have actually been some problems where for every lottery dollar that goes into the education fund, $1 of standard appropriation comes out. So it doesn't actually add anything to the education fund. It just lets legislators sort of play around with the budget and do all these creative Jedi mind tricks so that they can fund their pet projects with the general
it sounds
fund.
like bait and switch to me.
Yeah. And the promise is always we're going to help our kids. And technically it's helping kids by funding education, but not in the way that folks would imagine.
But we get coverage of the promises. I mean, in New York, and you point this out in your book, in many other states as well, they talk about the payoff for education and that sort of thing. Yeah. But we don't get a lot of coverage when, for example, state funds that used to go to education are pulled out and simply replaced by lottery funds.
The Lottery Commission has every incentive to tell players, look at all the good we're doing.
Right.
And it's, in fact, it's in their interest to do so, and they are under no legal or administrative obligation to say, actually, we're providing 1% of the school budget, or less than 1%, whatever the case may be. But again, they especially, we're approaching the holidays when folks are going to buy scratch tickets, and you justify that on, even if I lose, it's all right because it goes to help the state. The Lottery Commission wants you to think that it's doing a lot of good for the state, even if it's doing sort of very little.
Right. Now, you point out that states then are now in the business of selling a product, which is not what governments traditionally do.
Yeah.
So in trying to sell that product, there's tremendous advertising.
That's right.
Talk a little bit about the way lotteries are advertised.
Sure. So it's changed over time, and I think now the lottery advertising is actually a lot calmer than it used to be. I mean, you might remember, I don't, but in the 80s and 90s, when these sort of big rollover jackpot games were just starting to emerge, a lot of the advertising was, you're going to win,
right,
effectively,
yep,
and really promising social mobility, really promising a jackpot. And I think that is been toned down a lot, in part because lottery commissions realize you can't promise players they're going to win, and then eventually they're going to wake up and realize that they're not winning, and they're going to stop playing. So the advertising now, I think, has two main focuses. One is that it's fun to play, that the experience of playing the lottery is fun, and you should continue to play, not because you are going to win and you're going to get a windfall necessarily, but the act of playing in and of itself is enjoyable and pleasurable. And then the other one, as we discussed, is the benefits for the state, and that you should keep playing because it's a good deed. Even if you lose, you're doing a good thing for children.
When they do this advertising, they know who the target audience is. They know who's most likely to play.
That's right.
The lotteries, whatever the games or the Powerball or whatever. So talk about how the players are targeted?
Yeah, well, it's cyclical, and I found all these documents from state lottery commissions from the 80s and 90s when lotteries were getting started or ramping up their advertising that say, oh, we anticipate this game is going to be received most favorably in the black community or in the Latino community or in the poor community, so let's advertise there more heavily. So you advertise there heavily, then those players play a lot, and then you say, oh, who's playing this game? Oh, it's the black community, let's advertise even more there, and then there's more players, and it's cyclical, that I hope has changed in some ways. There are a lot of the advertising that we see now is sort of point of sale advertising. So at your local convenience store, at your local liquor store, there'll be a billboard or a sign, whatever the case may be. And a recent investigation from the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism at the University of Maryland found that lottery outlets are disproportionately concentrated in black and brown communities in many states. Not across the country, not everywhere, but in many states. So that's sort of an overlooked part of this advertising problem is that in some places you don't even need a big billboard because all you have is the sign outside the liquor store that does a lot of the work for you.
Right. So you made it clear in your conclusion to the book that your belief is that government-run lotteries should not exist in the modern United States. But you also acknowledge that they're not going anywhere, at least anytime soon. So since they're going to be around for a while, what are some of the things that some steps you'd like to see taken, or maybe some reforms so that they would be fairer or less regressive or more honest in their approach to players?
Yeah.
What would you like to see
happen?
happen?
So the dream reform is to enact to close a loophole that the Federal Trade Commission, there's a Federal Trade Commission loophole that exempts state-run agencies from truth in advertising law. And as a result, state lotteries don't have to abide by all the usual regulations that raffles and sweepstakes advertising is subject to. So the advertising that we discussed is exempt from these laws, and I think that loophole, only through an act of Congress, could be closed. That's like sort of a dream list happening at the federal level, and the state of Congress these days, I'm not optimistic, but there's a lot that could happen at the state level that is a lot more achievable, all of which have precedent that could be done. So these are things like limiting the size of the cost of a scratch-off ticket, as we mentioned earlier, limiting the size of Powerball or Mega Millions or Lotto jackpots, just to make them slightly less enticing. A major one would be ending or not advancing the sale of lottery tickets over the internet or through mobile apps, which has been sort of the new trend these days. So, advertising regulations, talk about those. Again, all of these have precedent. All of them could be done at the state level by state agencies, and all, I hope, would be impactful in reducing the predatory nature of lotteries in many states.
Now, you tell several moving stories in your book about lottery players, and in some cases their families, who you interviewed. Were there any that, was there one or two that really struck you personally or that surprised you or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I'll always come back to sort of the opening anecdote, a man named Leo McCord, who's now 70 years old and lives in Chicago and lived there his whole life.
70 years old.
That's right. And he's been playing the lottery since 1974 when it started in Illinois. And his mother worked with Dr. Martin Luther King as a civil rights advocate in the city in the 60s, and she organized a boycott against the lottery in the 1986, sort of after seeing this predatory advertising in their poor black community on the west side of Chicago. And he got involved in that boycott briefly again at that time, but has basically been playing the lottery ever since, and even long before then, and he won $100,000, I think around 2007, and it helped certainly, but he, by his own admission, even with that win, knows he's lost more than he's won.
Wow.
And he keeps playing. He sees it not as gambling per se, but really as a form of entertainment. He, by his own admission, he doesn't buy he doesn't buy movie tickets. He doesn't buy alcohol. He just plays the lottery. That's what he does. And I think he would know, especially with his mother's legacy, that that's not just gambling, that there is something about the pursuit of the American dream sort of going on here. But the fact that he keeps playing and has kept playing since, even after getting involved in a boycott against the Illinois lottery for predatory advertising in black communities 30, 40 years ago, is pretty astounding, and I think pretty reflective of these longtime players who've devoted their lives in many ways to the lottery.
So we've only got a minute left. how did you become so involved in lotteries?
Yeah. Well, I'm, I think I'm a child of the Great Recession in many ways, and was interested
Right.
in income inequality as an idea, and that sort of led me more and more away from inequality towards this idea of opportunity, and how do people, especially lower income people, see the chances for the American dream today. And sort of the pursuit of that almost accidentally sort of brought me to lottery tickets and brought me to lottery winners as people who have achieved the American dream by some definition, which, again, one thing led to another, and now here I am 7 years later talking to you about a book I wrote about state lotteries that I hope can be impactful as sort of the first study of this industry published in over 30 years.
Well, it's a terrific book, so congratulations.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming in. I
Thank you for
appreciate
having
it.
me. Yeah.
We've been talking with Jonathan Cohen, the author of a fine new book called For a Dollar and a Dream. I'm Bob Herbert. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.